The forest was alive, but it wasn't the warm kind of alive one would expect. The trees, towering and ancient, loomed like sentinels in the early morning mist, their thick trunks wrapped in a tangled mess of frozen vines. The ground was hard, a dull grayish-brown beneath the frost, each step a reminder of the cold that had settled into every crevice of this isolated corner of the world. The once thick canopy had thinned over centuries, and now the only sky above was an overcast expanse of white, barely letting any sunlight touch the frozen earth. The silence in this secluded wildlife sanctuary was deafening. Riley, a conservationist from a nearby research station, had wandered deeper into the forest than she had ever dared. She had come to document the mysterious creatures that had taken refuge here, a species she had only heard about in legends. It was said that these creatures were ancient, cold-blooded survivors who had adapted to an environment the world's reptiles couldn't endure. But the moment she entered this forest, something felt different. The usual sounds of the forest were absent. The chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, even the occasional crack of twigs underfoot, replaced instead by a heavy, unsettling quiet. Every breath she took seemed to hang in the frigid air, her exhales turning into tiny clouds that drifted away like ghostly whispers. Her every movement felt measured, cautious. The place had an eerie presence, as though the forest itself were aware of her. She crouched to study the ground, her gloved fingers brushing against tracks. The markings were unmistakable. Huge, elongated footprints, far larger than any predator she had ever seen. She had heard whispers of these creatures from indigenous tribes, stories passed down from generation to generation, describing monsters with skin thick like armor, scales that shimmered in the light of the pale sun, but no one had ever captured proof of their existence. No one had ventured deep enough into the wilderness and returned to tell the tale. But Riley had. She had made it this far, and the trail was undeniable. Her heart raced as the sound of cracking branches echoed faintly through the air. She froze, every muscle in her body tensing, the hairs on her neck prickling with the sensation of being watched. But when she scanned the dense, shadowed forest around her, there was no sign of movement. The trees stood still, their frozen limbs creaking under the weight of the cold. The forest was empty, yet it didn't feel empty. There was something out there, something watching. Minutes passed. Riley took another step, then another, carefully. She moved with practiced silence, following the tracks deeper into the wilderness. Her instincts, honed over years of fieldwork, told her she was getting closer. The tracks were fresh, newly formed, meaning the creatures were near. Then she saw it. Through the frost-laden branches of a massive fir, a silhouette moved. It was large, far larger than any bear, far larger than any predator she had ever encountered in her years of study. A massive shape, its body outlined against the mist, its long tail flicking from side to side as it stalked with unnatural grace. A reptile. Riley's heart pounded in her chest as she slowly backed away, instinctively drawing closer to the trunk of a nearby tree for cover. The beast didn't notice her, at least not yet, but its presence, its sheer size, was enough to make her pulse race. She couldn't believe it. This was the creature she had been hunting for, the one whispered about by the old hunters. But it wasn't alone. There were others. The distant sound of rustling echoed, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Riley's breath caught in her throat as more shapes emerged from the shadows. These creatures, like the first, were enormous, their muscular frames covered in thick, dark scales that gleamed in the cold mist. Some had long, powerful claws. Others had feathers running along their spines, flaring out like the plumage of an ancient bird. Their reptilian eyes gleamed with a primal intelligence, scanning the surroundings as they moved in synchrony. They were not beasts of the wild, they were rulers, and this was their kingdom. Riley's hands gripped the bark of the tree, her pulse hammering in her ears as she realized that these creatures weren't just surviving, they were thriving. And they were not the primitive, cold-blooded remnants of the past that she had imagined. They had evolved, adapted to the frozen wilderness, and now ruled it. They were kings, and this forest was their kingdom. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the air felt heavier now, thick with tension. Her eyes scanned the creatures as they gathered around a clearing, their massive bodies moving with a disturbing ease. But something else was happening. A distant rumble. The earth trembled beneath her feet, a low growl that seemed to reverberate through her very bones. The creatures stiffened, their heads lifting as they turned their attention toward the source of the disturbance. Something was coming. Riley didn't have time to process the enormity of what was happening. She turned and bolted, her feet crunching against the frozen ground, her heart pounding louder than ever. Behind her, the ground trembled with each massive footfall, a sound that filled the silence of the forest with a thundering chaos. She didn't dare look back, but the weight of the air, the sense that the entire forest was closing in around her, told her that the creatures were in pursuit. The trees grew thicker, their branches twisting together like a dense web, the space between them narrowing as if to trap her. Riley's breath came in ragged gasps as she darted through the labyrinth of ice-covered foliage. Every step felt slower than the last, as if the very world was conspiring to keep her from escaping. Then, suddenly, a large form emerged from the shadows, blocking her path. Riley skidded to a halt just in time to avoid slamming into the massive creature. It wasn't one of the reptile kings. It was something else entirely. A creature of stone and ice. Its body was an enormous mass of frozen rock, jagged edges like shards of broken glass glinting under the pale sunlight. Its eyes were two glowing orbs, a fierce, unnatural glow that burned through the icy mist. The beast was an enigma, neither reptile nor mammal, neither predator nor prey. It was a creature forged by the cold itself, a being that had somehow risen from the earth to challenge the reptile kings. And it was not alone. More figures emerged, surrounding her. These were not dinosaurs, nor any creature Riley had ever encountered. They were older, much older than anything she had ever studied. Beasts of ancient ice and rock, creatures who had been slumbering beneath the earth, waiting for the right moment to rise. The earth continued to rumble beneath Riley's feet, the trembling intensifying as more of these stone and ice creatures emerged from the shadows, their glowing eyes now fixed on her. There was no mistaking the immense power in their presence. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if they had all the time in the world to reclaim what was theirs. A deep, unsettling silence hung in the air, only broken by the crunching of frost under their weight. Riley's mind raced, her body frozen in place, heart thumping in her chest. She had no weapons, no tools to defend herself. There was no escape. She was caught in the middle of something ancient, something beyond her understanding. The reptile kings had their kingdom, but now, it seemed, these creatures of ice and stone had come to claim it. As the creatures closed in on her, Riley's instincts kicked in, the survivalist in her rising to the surface. She could feel the weight of the forest closing in, but she also knew she needed to act quickly. She had learned that these wild creatures, the ancient ones, the ones that had adapted to the harshest environments, were not mindless beasts. They were intelligent, and they were watching her, calculating her every move. One of the ice creatures tilted its head slightly, its glowing eyes never leaving her, as if weighing whether she was a threat or an intruder. Riley slowly backed away, her boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. Each step felt like a test of her fate, but as she moved, something unexpected happened. The ground under her feet shifted. a deep, resonating growl echoing through the air. Without warning, a massive reptile king, its scales shimmering in the cold light, lunged from the shadows, a blur of muscle and power. It let out a sound, a mixture of a hiss and a roar, so deafening that it shook the air around her. The ice creatures paused, momentarily frozen in place, as if the reptile's roar had sent shock waves through their very existence. Then, without warning, the reptile king swung its tail, crashing it against one of the ice creatures. The impact was violent, splintering the frozen figure into pieces, shards of ice scattering in every direction. The surviving ice creature let out a primal screech, a sound that was both anguished and defiant. But before it could retaliate, another reptile king, its eyes narrowed and focused, charged from the other side, slamming into the creature and sending it crashing into a nearby tree. The forest groaned under the weight of their battle. Riley stood frozen, watching the spectacle unfold before her eyes. The reptile kings fought with an intensity and ferocity she had never imagined. They were not merely surviving, they were fighting to protect what was theirs. The stone and ice creatures, though formidable, were outmatched in this environment, their cold, brittle forms vulnerable against the powerful reptiles. It was a battle of the ages, a clash between ancient kings of two worlds, one ruled by fire and blood, the other by stone and frost. As the chaos unfolded, Riley realized something. The reptile kings weren't just defending themselves. They were fighting for dominion over the land. This forest, this frozen wilderness, was more than just a sanctuary for creatures like them. It was a battleground, a place where the ancient forces of nature waged war in silence, hidden from the world. Riley's breath caught in her throat as she turned to run. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew she needed to get out. She could hear the battle raging behind her, the growls and roars mixing with the screeches of the ice creatures. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to escape while she could. The forest had become a place of unimaginable violence, and she had no place in it. But as she sprinted through the dense underbrush, her foot caught on something, a thick, vine-like root buried beneath the snow, and she tumbled forward, crashing to the ground with a sharp gasp. Her chest tightened as she struggled to regain her footing, but when she looked up, her heart froze in her chest. The battle had stopped. All around her, the creatures had fallen still. The reptile king stood motionless, their massive bodies coiled and tense, their eyes scanning the horizon. The ice creatures, too, had ceased their movements, their glowing eyes now dimming as if the fight had drained them. In the eerie silence that followed, Riley dared not move. Then, from the shadows, a new presence emerged. It was unlike anything Riley had ever seen. Taller, more slender than the massive reptile kings, this creature moved with an otherworldly grace. Its body a fluid blend of scales and feathers, its eyes gleaming with a wisdom that seemed older than time itself. This was not a king of reptile or stone. It was something else. A being of both fire and ice, of earth and sky. The creature's eyes locked with Riley's, and for a brief moment everything seemed to stop. She could feel the weight of its gaze, as if it were peering into her very soul. She felt small, insignificant, like a mere speck in the face of something vast and ancient. The creature's presence was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. It was a being of the forest, the true ruler, a creature not of dominance but of balance. Not the backbone of a creature, but a balance. The battle between the reptiles and the ice creatures had been a power struggle, a clash of titans. But this being was the keeper of the forest, the one who held dominion over the land in a way neither the cold-blooded reptiles nor the ice beasts could ever understand. Riley slowly stood, her legs trembling beneath her, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The creature didn't move, It simply observed her, and in that moment, Riley understood. She wasn't just an intruder in this world, she was a witness to something far greater than herself. Something that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface of the earth, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The creature's eyes shifted, glancing at the fallen bodies of the reptile kings and the ice creatures. Then, with a subtle movement, it turned and walked away, vanishing back into the forest, as silently as it had appeared. And just like that, the forest returned to its cold, eerie quiet. The battle was over. Riley stood alone, her heart still racing, the weight of what she had witnessed settling heavily in her chest. She had come seeking the reptile kings, but what she had found was something far older, far more powerful. And as she turned to leave the forest, the chilling thought crossed her mind. This place was not just a sanctuary. It was a battleground, a place where ancient forces still waged the silence that enveloped Riley was deafening. She stood there, frozen in place, her breath heavy and shallow, her eyes darting around the forest, trying to make sense of everything. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with snow, their outlines softened by the falling flakes. The sky had grown even darker, the clouds thickening as if to conceal the secrets of the forest beneath their weight. For a long moment, Riley didn't move. She wasn't sure what had just happened, or how to process the overwhelming experience she had just witnessed. The battle between the reptile kings and the ice creatures had been fierce, violent, and primal. But what stood out the most was the creature that had intervened, the one whose presence seemed to shift the very essence of the forest. It wasn't just the ruler of this land. It was something more, something older, something bound to the elements in a way Riley could never comprehend. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to leave the place before she became a part of the forest's endless cycle. But she felt tethered, anchored by something invisible, as though the forest itself had claimed her, as though she were no longer just a visitor. Riley's footsteps seemed muted against the snow as she began to walk, the eerie quiet of the forest pressing in on her from all sides. As she moved through the thick woods, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Every now and then she could catch the faintest sound, a rustle of leaves, a crackling branch, a low rhythmic thud of something massive moving in the distance. She looked over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the darkening landscape, but the trees offered no answers. They remained unmoving, as though they too were waiting, watching. The wind began to pick up, swirling through the branches, sending a shiver through Riley's bones. It was as if the air itself was alive, carrying whispers of ancient things buried deep within the earth. The further she ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. She could feel the weight of the forest closing in around her, like the very trees themselves were leaning in to observe her every movement. The quiet hum of life that had once filled the woods had vanished, leaving an unsettling stillness in its wake. Then, just as the tension became unbearable, Riley saw it. A shadow flitting between the trees, too quick to fully register, but unmistakably there. Her heart skipped a beat as she froze, her breath caught in her throat. The shadow moved again, closer this time. It was not a trick of the light or the wind. There was something in the forest with her, something that wasn't a figment of her imagination. Riley's hand instinctively reached for the knife at her belt, though she knew it was little more than a comfort now. It was no match for the ancient power that lingered in the air. Her pulse quickened as she took another step, eyes wide, scanning every corner of the forest. The shadow moved again, and this time it stopped. Right in front of her. It was the creature, the one that had intervened in the battle. Its form emerged from the shadows slowly, impossibly tall and ethereal. The creature's skin shimmered with an iridescent sheen, a strange mix of scales, feathers, and frost that seemed to change depending on the light. It stood motionless, its eyes locking with hers once more. The deep, ancient intelligence in its gaze sent a ripple of cold down her spine. Riley took a cautious step back, her mind racing, her body tensed for flight. But the creature didn't move. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as though studying her, analyzing her every reaction. The forest had grown colder, the air sharp with the scent of snow and ice. Riley's breath misted in front of her face, her skin prickling as the weight of the creature's gaze bore into her. For a moment there was no sound, no movement. It felt as if time itself had stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the creature stepped forward. Riley instinctively flinched, but it did not approach with aggression. Instead, it moved with a grace that was almost fluid, its steps barely disturbing the snow beneath it. As it drew nearer, Riley could see the faint glimmer of something more beneath the surface of its being, something beyond its strange, ethereal form. The creature stopped just a few feet away, its presence overwhelming in its stillness. It lowered its head slightly, its glowing eyes now softened, as if acknowledging her presence not as an intruder, but as something more, a witness to its existence, to the ancient balance it maintained. It raised a single, clawed foot, placing it carefully on the ground, as though inviting Riley to follow. The gesture, subtle as it was, left Riley speechless. She could feel the pull of the creature's presence, its ancient power, and the deep connection it had with the land. She realized with a sinking feeling that this was not a place for human intervention. The forest, the creatures, the balance of fire and ice, it had all existed long before her, and it would continue long after she was gone. Riley's mind reeled with questions. What was this creature? What was its purpose? Why had it spared her? But the answers eluded her, like wisps of smoke slipping through her fingers. She knew one thing for certain. She was standing in the presence of something far beyond her understanding.